Hi everyone, welcome to our first webinar from Vibe. This session's on the psychology behind everyday heterosexism in construction. So I'm Shadi, I'm the co-chair of WSP's Vibe. And before we start, can I please ask that you put your microphone on record until the end. We have a few Q&A sessions towards the end of the presentation, so you can speak then. It just helps us keep it quite clean. We are recording this session as well, so we're trying to keep the noise in the background as little as possible. This Pride Month, we are focusing on everyday situations in the office and how language can affect LGBT plus employees and our allies as well. And for that, we actually have invited Rosemary Lobban from the University of Greenwich to do a presentation on the psychology behind everyday heterosexism in the construction industry. So I'll pass on to Rosemary. Pass on to Rosemary now. Oh, just a quick note, sorry. During the presentation, if you do have any questions, for those using the web app, please use a chat box to type in your questions and we can answer them towards the end. So yeah, I'll pass on to Rosemary now.
Thanks very much, Shadi. Okay, hello everybody. So yeah, as Shadi mentioned, I'm going to talk to you today about everyday heterosexism in construction. Heterosexism being another term for homophobia. Homophobia tends to have connotations of fear, and heterosexism is a bit broader. So I'm using that term just to clarify. So I'll go over what I mean by everyday heterosexism. Then I'll move on to current understanding of the concept and the implications of that for practice. Then I'll move on to some criticisms of current approaches and then have a look at how those criticisms might be addressed. So there we go. Okay. So what is everyday heterosexism? Well, basically, the idea is it's subtle, everyday slights and indignities. So things like use of heterosexist terminology, that might be something like referring to something bad as gay, oh, that's so gay, for example. Making heteronormative assumptions, so that's assuming that heterosexuality is the norm. Asking a gay colleague why his wife never attends company events would be an example of that. Assumption of universal experience, so for example, asking a bisexual woman to speak on behalf of all bisexual women. Exoticization, so that's, for example, a heterosexual man asking a lesbian couple if he can watch them engage in intimate behaviour. Expression of discomfort or disapproval, for example, somebody pulling a face if they see two men kissing. And also assumption of sexual deviance. An example of that might be asking a gay relative whether he has regular AIDS tests. And due to the subtlety of some of these things which occur in everyday conversations between people, it's very easily brushed off as harmless banter by people, which is a point I'll return to shortly. So what evidence is there that this type of thing is going on in the construction industry? Well, as some of you may be aware, in 2013, the Architects Journal undertook a study of the experiences of gay architects, and half had encountered homophobia in the work. The industry-wide scale of the problem was flagged up, so in response, the journal initiated a joint survey with New Civil Engineer, which you may be familiar with, which 1,000 people across the whole of the construction industry, all the various sectors participated in. And findings indicated that 63% of gay employees had heard homophobic comments over the preceding 12 months, and that actually jumped in contracting to 85%. You can see that represented in the graph on the left-hand side. These comments reportedly often took the form of low-level daily slights akin to the everyday heterosexism I've just described. Moreover, less than half of heterosexual employees reported hearing homophobic comments or the word gay used as a pejorative. This suggests that heterosexual employees are perhaps less likely to notice homophobic comments, and that what many consider harmless or inoffensive is in fact having a bigger impact on sexual minorities than they realise. Relatedly, on construction sites, only 14% of gay employees are comfortable being out about their sexual orientation. So, what are the effects of this? Well, exposure to everyday prejudice has been identified in a number of studies as having a negative impact on individuals. This tends to be in terms of two things: rumination, so that's diverting mental energy away from primary tasks, which affects people's ability to get on with their jobs. And secondly, a cumulative impact on well-being, a decline of well-being over time as people are chipped away. Everyday heterosexism is also impacting recruitment and the retention of skilled employees in vital industries such as engineering. Many of you may be familiar with the recent joint report with the government produced by Mark McBride-Wright. It also is reportedly affecting productivity in these industries. So heterosexism in the construction industry appears to be both prevalent and harmful, both to individuals and also to the industry as a whole. And as a result, a range of recommendations and interventions have been rolled out over the last few years. On the whole, these are actually based on widely endorsed psychological theories. So let's take a look at those. Okay, so on the left-hand column, you can see 3 different strategies which are being promoted and used to great effect at the moment. So we've got, first of all, celebrating difference. Now, behind this, there are a couple of underlying psychological theories. The first is the broad subdiscipline of individual differences. And some of the assumptions behind the work done in that area is that people vary naturally in character and ability, and also some argue that they do so in complementary ways. Secondly, Allport's contact hypothesis, which works on the assumption that prejudice is something which lives inside individual people, and change comes about when those people are exposed to the groups to which they're prejudiced. Secondly, the strategy of raising awareness of unconscious biases. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. You may have undergone training. So this is very much based on something called cognitive miser theory, which came out in the 1990s. And the assumption behind this theory is that prejudice is a byproduct of limitations in the way that we process perceptual information. So we live in this incredibly complex world. We can't possibly process everything that's coming our way and make sense of it. And so stereotypes are shortcuts, cognitive shortcuts, which we use to help navigate this complex world. And thirdly, there is the strategy of encouraging employees to identify and report offensive language. Now, this isn't necessarily based on a particular psychological theory, more on a broad assumption that it's possible to construct lists of words or phrases that will be considered offensive across all situations and all contexts. So that's the roots. Now, there's been some fantastic work done and a lot of progress made, particularly in the last few years, using these strategies, and good work continues to go on. But some people argue that there are some elements which can be critiqued and perhaps need to be addressed. So just having a look at those criticisms, first of all, in terms of celebrating difference, some people argue that this actually forges disempowering identities for minority group members, and so affects buy-in from these groups. For example, people might not be keen to be labelled as victims or as different. Others argue, well, in some cases, arguments are made for inclusion on the basis of particular skills being attributed to particular groups. So, for example, I read a paper recently recommending that there should be more women in particular industries because they tend to have better soft skills. Now, this kind of thinking, some would argue, serves to perpetuate stereotypes rather than challenge them. Also, celebrating difference is thought by some to create division, because by highlighting difference, groups are defined in contrast to one another and set in direct competition with each other for resources. So this results in things like zero-sum arguments, when actually the whole industry stands to benefit from equality of opportunity. In terms of raising awareness of unconscious biases, some argue that this alienates members of so-called privileged groups by framing them as the problem, which can affect manager buy-in, especially in situations as in the construction industry where the margins are already slim and there's not a lot of budget to spend on equality and diversity. And also, it could be argued that the whole concept of unconscious biases could absolve people of responsibility for their actions, because if it's something that's natural and inevitable, then how can we problematise it? Finally, in terms of encouraging employees to identify and report offensive language, it could be argued that the meaning of words isn't fixed. So if you say something in one context, it can mean something completely different in another. And also, consideration hasn't really been given to what counts as prejudice to the people involved in interactions. They might not read something as prejudice. And of course, there is the criticism that I'm hearing a lot in my data of political correctness gone mad. There's a lot of resentment towards this strategy of, you know, telling tales on each other. Finally, as we've seen, heterosexist language can be very subtle, so it can be difficult to raise objections to it that will be taken seriously. So that's just some of the criticisms of the existing approaches. Now I'm going to move on to how some of those criticisms might be addressed. So in the research I'm conducting at the moment, I'm drawing upon discursive theory, and in doing so suggesting that prejudice is something which exists between people in language and interaction. It's something that happens in our interactions, and so we should study it as it actually naturally unfolds, rather than relying, for example, on retrospective reports. People do prejudice in order to accomplish particular actions relevant to the situation they're in. So people might be justifying an idea, they might be blaming somebody for something or a group for something, they might be defending their position, or they might be associating themselves or laying claim to an empowering identity. Doing prejudice is ubiquitously frowned upon. There's a norm against prejudice. Nobody wants to be seen to be prejudiced. And so people engage in strategies to mitigate against potential criticism. A common one is the use of disclaimers. I'm not homophobic, but I have lots of gay friends, but. And so the implications of this for method is that instead of relying on predefined ideas of what constitutes prejudicial behaviour, I'm analysing conversations, and I'm looking at what speakers and recipients in those conversations actually treat as prejudice, how they do that. So it might be by the use of disclaimers or a range of other strategies, and that's certainly emerging to be the case. and also how utterances treated as prejudice are managed in subsequent talk and to what effect. So when do things turn into confrontations, and how are they resolved? What other outcomes can there be when prejudice enters a conversation, and how is it managed? So I'm just going to give you a quick example of some data. So what we have here is just an extract from a group conversation between some employees on a major construction project in central London. They all knew each other, all working together, and people from a cross-section of different sectors in the industry. And we can see here, participant 2 at the beginning says, but the army is, but you know, you can now have gays and lesbians in the army, and they're actually going to chuck them up the front line, same as everybody else. But that took a long time. And then another participant responds to this. You can now have, so we can see there's a direct challenge there to something. Next, a lot of people in the group erupt into laughter. And then we have 2 participants. You no longer have to sign a declaration. It was only 30 years ago you had to sign a declaration to state you have no homosexual intent before you join the army. The person who lodged the criticism, participant 4, is that true? The 2 participants agree, yes. And then the original participant then proceeds with what he was talking about in the first place. And now you can now have homosexuals are now joining the army, and it is acceptable. So just to talk you through that, sorry for my acting, the excerpt featured on this slide, in lines 1 to 3, there is what might be considered to be an example of everyday heterosexism. So the statement, you can now have gays and lesbians in the army, and they're actually going to chuck them up the front line, same as everybody else, could be considered to be subtle heterosexism, everyday heterosexism, in the sense that it is treated as problematic by the speaker, first of all. So if you have a look at lines 1 and 2, there's a hell of a lot of hesitancy before he actually moves on to what he's saying. But what you can now have. Secondly, it's treated as problematic by the other recipient, the recipients in the conversation. So participant 4 on line 4 issues a direct challenge. You can now have, and it also features language which frames heterosexuals as normal, and by implication non-heterosexuals as abnormal. So going to chuck them up the front line, same as everybody else. It features language which kind of feels derogatory, but it's really hard to pinpoint exactly why, and therefore criticise it or even report it. So you can now have, it feels derogatory. He could have said something like, the ban on gays and lesbians has now been lifted, and that would have had a very different effect on the conversation and would have not likely been resulted in being challenged. What's also interesting is the way that the group deals with participant 4's challenge on line 4, because challenges, in particular accusations of prejudice, have the potential to cause conflict because they contravene conversational convention. That was a tongue twister. Agreement is generally the preferred outcome in conversations. So if people raise challenges or accuse people or imply that people are prejudiced, that goes against, you know, things, and then people tend to want to resolve that. And on line 5, we find that various members of the group respond to this challenge by laughing, which is a commonly used tool for diffusing tension and uncomfortable situations. And then in line 6 to 8, participants 5 and 1 opt for a different strategy, which has a similar effect. They respond by spouting a related fact rather than addressing the sentiment of participant 4's challenge. And so in doing so, they deflect away the focus from that challenge. And participant 4 accepts this diffusion of his challenge. He moves on to go, is that true? And the trouble is resolved, which leaves participant 2 free to carry on with his with what he was saying. Although note that after initially proceeding with the same wording, and now you can now have, He then corrects himself and then starts with a rephrase, homosexuals are now joining the army, da, 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 da. Now, findings such as this indicate that simply banning particular words or phrases is unlikely to be effective. Instead, it's important to understand how and why heterosexist talk arises in situationally specific ways and how it can be managed in interactions. So, taking all that into consideration, going back to the earlier strategies which are commonly used at the moment to great effect, but considering how they might be improved or built upon, in terms of celebrating difference and the criticism that it forges disempowering identities and perpetuates stereotypes and creates division, you might consider promoting working towards a common goal for the common good. In terms of raising awareness of unconscious biases being thought to potentially alienate members of privileged groups and absolve them of responsibility for their actions, it might be an idea to suggest that prejudice is performed between people in interactions rather than held by individuals, and this might encourage and empower managers and employees to do things differently. And finally, the criticism that the meaning of words and phrases varies according to context. Well, as I've demonstrated, using examples of real talk, we can see how heterosexist language, what it actually looks like in practice, how it functions in interactions, and how confrontations arise and might be managed. And if anyone's interested in keeping abreast of developments relating to the latter point, which is what I'm working on at the moment, I'd be delighted to hear from you. My email address is on the next slide. Likewise, I'd be delighted to hear from anyone who'd be interested in participating in the research as an individual or as a group or department. So that's it. There's my email address, and I welcome any questions that anyone may have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rosemary. Just open up the floor here. If you do have any questions, I'll start with this. Rosemary, would you like to give a bit of a background about your study as well? And you asked for a call out for information, but maybe some background might help out.
Sure. So at the moment, I'm conducting a series of focus groups with people across all roles and sectors in the construction industry. And the aim is to just gather a broad range of different conversations in order to really discern how subtle heterosexism, everyday heterosexism comes about in conversations and how people manage it. You know, because I think it's really important to see what successful strategies are being employed by people and why people might be why are people enacting heterosexism? What makes it relevant for them to do it? Because if we don't understand why something's happening, it's very difficult to challenge that. So that's the main aim of the study which I'm conducting at the moment.
Thank you. Yeah, does anyone else have any questions of either myself or Rosemary? Okay. All right. Thank you. Just wanted to finish up by some references from...
Oh, there's some references if you're interested.
Just want to finish up about what Vibe are doing. Vibe are starting off with Pride Month and also going forward, we are supporting the No Bystanders campaign that Stonewall has set up. There's a video, a pledge that you sign up. I've recently signed up and we're asking our allies as well to sign up and advertise the pledge. I'll send these slides out afterwards and you can actually check out the campaign for yourself. Yeah, that's it from me. Again, love to send my thanks to Rosemary and thank you all for joining in. Little comment here. Thanks, Rosemary. Working towards a common good. Have you seen any examples of this? Sorry, this is from Joe.
Any good examples? I see. That's an excellent question. Yeah, it's something very much that I'm looking at the moment as the data in the data as it's emerging. I did quite a lot of preliminary field work, and it seems to be increasingly the case that people are taking that kind of line of thinking when they're designing interventions. So in terms of actually in people's conversations, it's not necessarily something which I'm looking at. But in terms of so the study that I'm doing at the moment isn't necessarily concerned with that. But some of the ethnographic fieldwork, which I did beforehand, is very much looking at the strategies which companies are employing at the moment, and quite a few are trying to get more managers or people who are considered to be from inverted commas privileged groups on board with initiatives. And so it does seem to be increasingly important to people that they're talking in terms which are appealing to all. And so in that sense, I have found some examples. And yeah, I'd be happy to share my findings with you once they're written up if you're interested.
I'll be very interested. Thank you. Okay. We'll wrap up there. Thanks all for joining in. I'll see you at the next one.